Get frogged. Wait. Hold on. Get frogged. My hands are over here now. After the Frog Boy color, I thought that I was ready to move on, do some crimes with the GBA or maybe the Super Game Boy. Now that would be character growth. Who am I kidding? The Game Boy Color is still ripe with potential, and I'm never one to back down from taking the easy way out. But where do I take things from here? I've already made the GBC wide, but what if I made it tall? Shit. Okay, so clearly that's not sufficiently unique. I needed something more. Then I got to thinking, how small could I make the GBC? Now, I know what you're thinking, but Frogman, there are already tiny Game Boys. How do you get smaller than something like the Thumby? And I'll answer that question with another question. How about you shut the fuck? Being the pedant that I am, the Thumby or any of the dozens of small emulator consoles available nowadays are not Game Boys, despite what hyperbolic articles might lead you to believe. So for this project, I gave myself two key restrictions. It has to make use of the core original Game Boy Color hardware, no emulation. And it has to be capable of reading original Game Boy and Game Boy Color cartridges. Literally everything else is on the table as an option. Except for this. Never, ever this. The obvious starting point for this project was to figure out a reasonable baseline for the size of the system. An original Game Boy cartridge is about 65mm by 57mm. Of course, we need some way to read the cartridge, so naturally we need to look at the size when mated with a cartridge connector. Mated with a GBC cartridge connector, the length extends to 72.5mm, and we widen out to a staggering 70mm. An alternative is to go with a Game Boy Advance SP style cartridge connector, which is no wider than a cartridge itself, and is only marginally longer than the alternative in the mated configuration at about 74mm long. It's also about 2mm thinner than a GBC connector, which allows us to shave off that all-important thickness. Next up, the footprint for the GBC CPU is about 18mm long in the y-axis. Combined with our mated cartridge length of 74mm, as well as some extra buffer for other components, we're looking at somewhere around 100mm for the length and 60mm for the width of this device, give or take a few. With that as a starting point, I went into Fusion and started roughing out the general shape for both the shell and the PCB, including the mounting holes for the cartridge slot so I could do a test fit for position and clearance. It was really important to nail down dimensions for things like buttons early on before it became too difficult to make large changes. Like with the Frog Boy, I chose compatibility with GBA SP buttons, which helps save several millimeters of thickness versus standard Game Boy Color membrane buttons. Wow. Things are going pretty well at this point, but there's still one major piece to sort out that's largely out of my control. And by that I mean I'm too lazy for something bespoke. I'm talking about the screen and associated driver board. Luckily, I'm well versed in aftermarket screen lore for the Game Boy Color, and I pretty quickly zeroed in on this Cloud Game Store 2.45-inch kit. It has a similar viewable area to the OEM screen, it's power efficient, and it should fit nicely into the shell that I've got going on. Measurements in hand, I went back into Fusion and added a recessed area on the inside of the front shell half that neatly cradles the LCD. I was originally planning on this being a lensless design, but was convinced otherwise by some smart folks. So on the front, I also added a recessed area for a simple lens. Along with the screen changes, I made some other updates. ridges to guide the carts in, screw holes, etc. We're in the home stretch now, and through the simple process of drawing the rest of the f***ing owl, I arrived at this. I added cutouts on the bottom for the power button, USB-C port, and EXT port. Also new is a spot for a shell label like you see on all OEM Game Boys, as well as an engraving of the Froggo. The last functional piece is this shield for the cartridge slot, which I added to enlarge the opening in the back shell and make it easier to mill. This was designed with SLS printing in mind, but it works in FDM as well in a pinch. Once I was pretty happy with the design, I moved on to some SLS and MJF nylon prints. These tend to be more accurate than FDM, with a much better surface finish than the latter. And once I was happy with how these turned out, I went up to a machined aluminum shell. This is the first one I had made with this process, and it turned out to be much closer to final than I would have expected. But we'll talk about that later. In parallel with the shell design, I started working on the circuit design. Lucky for me, I was able to leverage my designs for the Frogboy color as a starting point, which saved me a lot of time in terms of setting up a working schematic. Given the size constraints, I knew some things would have to be cut. The first thing to go was headphone output. I knew pretty early on that a headphone jack would eat up too much board space, so I made the somewhat painful decision to cut it. On the plus side, that decision also greatly simplified the audio amplifier design. The FBC uses separate mono amplifiers for the left and right channels, but because I'm only using one speaker in this case, and there's no more headphone output, I'm able to mix the left and right channels using a couple resistors before feeding them into a single mono amp. This saved me some time looking for and familiarizing myself with a new amp chip. Next was the LCD connector. The GBC uses a 50-pin connector, and a lot of those pins are unused by the screen I chose, which offers an opportunity for me to use a smaller connector. Because I can't use the flat flex cable included with the screen kit, I had to reverse engineer the original to figure out which pins it needs and use that mapping to design a smaller 28-pin interface for a custom FFC. The stock FFC also includes a touch sensor for brightness control, so I added a pin for that on my custom interface so I could use some circuitry to control it with a button combo instead. I was originally planning to cut the EXT port to save on space, but after receiving the initial prototype here, I realized that I had just enough space to add it back in if I moved things around a bit. Personally, this was a huge win for me, not because I have any friends to actually make use of this with, but because I don't have to hear other people without friends complain. From there, it's pretty much a straight lift from the rest of the Frogboy schematic. Both devices use the same tactile switches, plus power, charging, and reset circuitry. Sizing down many of the passives buys me a bit more extra space, then it's just a matter of dropping all of the components onto the PCB and... oh. Needless to say, placing components and routing this was a challenge. The power circuit is especially tight, with most of the board space being eaten up by the RAM and CPU. The CPU also presented its own challenges because the cartridge slot is located above it, rather than below like on every other GBC form factor. On top of that, there's no room on either the front or the back of the main part of the board to place the LCD connector. So it, along with the power indicator circuitry, gets placed on this thin strip up the right-hand side, out of the way. I don't fully hate myself, so I again designed this as a 4-layer board, which makes it much easier to route all of the signal traces without making a total mess of my power and ground planes. Spoiler alert, I am living proof that if you put a monkey in a room with a typewriter, he will eventually route a complicated PCB and iterate on it multiple times. This is the initial prototype, which was largely functional from the start, but came before I decided to fit the EXT port and used a 29-pin top connector for the LCD, which turned out to be too bulky. The second PCB brought back the EXT port and switched to a smaller 28-pin LCD connector. But after further testing, I decided that I wanted to add over-discharge protection for the battery. The third prototype was almost perfect, and other than some minor component placement differences, it's almost identical to this final, for now, iteration. That brings us to the final parts for this project. PCBWay graciously provided me with the parts that you see here, including a full aluminum shell anodized in this beautiful purple color, as well as this spiffy matte green PCB, which came out looking very nice. In addition to these, the build needs the custom cartridge shield, Game Boy Advance SP buttons and membranes, a speaker, and 7 M2x3 machine screws, plus all of the various components for the PCB. And with that out of the way, I'll let the build process speak for itself. And there we have it, a completed Tadboy color. It does pretty much everything you'd expect a GBC to do. Plays games, plays 2-player games, and that's basically it. But that's about all the original GBC does as well, and that's enough for me. Would I like to fit a headphone jack in here? Absolutely. Would I benefit from the IR functionality getting brought back? No, of course not. What's wrong with you? At the end of the day, I'm super proud of how this thing turned out. Perhaps even more so than the Frogboy color, and that's saying a lot for a project I originally intended as a sort of filler between more serious projects. As before, all of the files for building your own are available to order from PCBWay, and doing so really helps me out so that I can continue working on cool projects. Thanks again to PCBWay for providing some of the parts in this video. I've also made the files available on GitHub so that you can order your parts from the supplier of your choosing, or even print your own in the case of the shell. Technical drawings for the lens are also included, but to make them more easily accessible without having to order 100 like I did, I'll also have these available in my shop, at least for a little while. Thanks again for watching. If you like what I'm doing, please like and subscribe, or leave angry comments about the volume wheel to boost engagement. You know, whatever works best. I'll catch y'all next time.